What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Do you know your true worth? Is the kind of oversized question that usually lives on a coffee mug or an HR slide and makes me want to disappear into the floor. Yet the only reason it mattered this time was because I finally stopped auditioning for my own family and treated my life like an actual business decision, which is how I ended up walking into my performance review with Evelyn. Hearing words that sounded ordinary, operational continuity, stabilized escalations, cross-functional dependencies, and watching her slide a simple letter across the table that confirmed what my numbers had been hinting at for months, a one-time performance bonus that would never trend on a chart, but, if handled correctly, could be the hinge between another year of being the supporting act at Ryan's Gala and the year I quietly moved my center of gravity to a front door with my name on it. I signed the non-disclosure because it was short and sane, not because I enjoy secrecy, and while Evelyn talked through the company's rationale in her even, unhurried tone that always calms me down, my head was already doing the arithmetic you learn when you are the person who pays attention to how things actually get paid for, not the headline number, which looks glamorous in a screenshot, but the closing costs, the reserves lenders like to see, the way underwriters view one-time income, and the reality that the Outer Banks asks you to think like a grown adult about flood zones, wind coverage, and whether you plan to rent or simply live. And as I walked back to my desk, I felt a rare quiet land in my chest. Not the resignation that comes when Linda announces yet another theme for Ryan's birthday while casually suggesting we merge mine into his weekend, but the quiet of a plan that does not need applause to exist. I called Maya that night because Maya lives where numbers meet paperwork without drama, and we went line by line through what a lender would need to view me as credible without a single phone call to Linda, since history has taught me that any attempt at looping the family in becomes an invitation for Linda to curate the optics and for Mark to sigh about timing while Ryan drops a joke that makes the room laugh and leaves me holding the bag of feelings. Pay stubs would be easy, bank statements would need context for 2 small deposits from selling furniture. The bonus letter would be useful for assets, but not counted as recurring income, and the rest would come down to discipline, which I have in abundance when I am not trying to earn the kind of love that gets measured in a cake budget and a hashtag. The pre-approval checklist became my favorite kind of to-do list because it was about control. Not control over people, which never works and always backfires, but control over inputs that either align or do not. So I open the spreadsheet I label Plan B, which is funny because it is really Plan A that I never felt permitted to say out loud, and I added rows for inspection fees, appraisal, insurance quotes, a line for wind and hail coverage because you cannot wish storms away, and a polite reminder to myself that not every good thing requires an announcement. The same way good negotiations rarely happen in public, which is why at work I always remove the theater and let documents do the talking. Meanwhile, the group chat for Ryan's Gala moved with its usual energy, Linda sharing vendor screenshots as if she had just discovered the concept of a professional, Mark dropping a thumbs up that reads like consent even when he has not read the thread, and Ryan floating song lists and inflated headcount estimates that everyone treats like a growth metric. And while all of that churned, I held my thumbs still because silence used on purpose is not passive, it is protective, which is why when Dana messaged to ask if I could chip in for an upgraded photo booth, a real thing, apparently, I typed a courteous no and let the conversation end without explaining my budget to anyone who confuses confetti with care. The pre-approval letter landed 2 days later with a number that fit my sheet if I kept my eyes on the monthly and the reserves, so I took a personal day, drove down to see 3 places that sounded reasonable in the listings. And I did what any adult should do when shopping for a life change. I asked boring questions and took boring notes, and I kept my focus on layout, maintenance, HOA bylaws, and insurance eligibility rather than whatever story the listing agent tried to tell, because I am not building a mood, I am building a plan that can survive contact with reality, including the part where I will still have to open Slack on Mondays and answer for outcomes. Back home that night, I watched Linda's planning escalate into costume level, and I felt that old pull to perform helpful daughter one more time. Yet I did not, because the minute I start tap dancing, the deal evaporates. And the truth is I have done the tap dance for years, I have baked, I have paid deposits, I have been told my birthday can be folded into Ryan's because family events are about togetherness, which is a neat slogan that usually translates to Ava handles logistics while Ryan handles applause, and I am tired in the kind of way you cannot sleep off. Evelyn asked me the next morning whether I needed time off around any personal milestones, a phrasing that let me keep the details to myself and made me feel seen without being exposed, so I scheduled a long weekend for the inspection window. I told no one why, and I moved my attention back to a vendor renegotiation that suddenly felt easier, because once you are pre-approved for something that belongs to you and to no one else, you stop rounding your sentences and you stop over-explaining. Which sounds small until you try it and realize how much of your voice had been living in apology. The offer paperwork arrived in my inbox the same afternoon. Linda posted a poll about signature cocktails for Ryan, and while the comments piled up with people suggesting silly names that would photograph well, I took a breath that felt like stepping out of a loop, and I read every clause twice. I asked Maya 2 questions I would have been embarrassed to ask 10 years ago. I signed my name where signatures go. And I put my phone face down so I would not flinch when the group chat lit up about centerpieces or seating charts or whether Aunt Carol should be placed near the DJ to feel included. Dana cornered me at the Gala planning dinner later that week and asked what I was doing for my birthday, as if this were an optional field on a form we could fill together. And I said I was keeping it low-key because this year I am working on something that does not require a guest list, and her face did that soft understanding thing that is half kindness and half strategy, and I let it slide because I did not owe her more. When the pre-approval letter turned into a live offer with inspection dates penciled, I realized the strangest thing about taking your life seriously. The people who always needed me loud and available barely noticed I had gone quiet, which made it easier to keep my cover through one more weekend of being pleasant while inside. I moved money where it needed to go, stacked documents in a portal that did not include Linda's email address, and told myself that this time I would not spend my birthday begging for a kind of attention that always comes with a tip jar attached. And if I walk into Ryan's party smiling and unbothered, pretending nothing is in motion while everything is in motion, will I hold my nerve long enough to get the offer accepted before Linda senses the shift and tries to pull me back into the script that always ends with me clapping for somebody else? Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because the real play rarely happens where the spotlight points, and while Linda rehearsed her welcome remarks in the rented hall and Ryan warmed up his smile for the photographer who insists on candids that are never candid, I walked in calm and neutral, said hello to the relatives who grade affection like a report card, and took a seat against the wall where the sound of everyone else's excitement could pass over me without taking anything I needed, since the only thing I needed that night was the quiet space to keep my cover intact long enough to push my life forward one more step without inviting the committee that has always believed my choices are a shared asset and my boundaries are a negotiable line item. The ritual unfolded with the precision of a script we have run too many times to count, Linda tapping the microphone to coax attention and then delivering that careful blend of nostalgia and self-congratulation that plays well in rooms like this. The jokes about Ryan being the family star and the nod to our other birthday somewhere in this month tossed toward me like a party favor, the applause warm and automatic, and the part of me that used to shrink went still instead because the more I practiced silence, the more I understood that you do not have to fight for oxygen when you brought your own tank, and my tank was the offer packet in my email, the inspection slot Maya had reserved, and the decision to let everyone believe what they wanted until the keys were in my hand and the paperwork sat in a folder with my name spelled correctly. I kept my answers short when people asked about work, not because I was hiding anything unethical, but because any detail becomes a hook for someone else's narrative. And I have learned the hard way that when you give Linda a hook, she will hang an entire theory on it and then expect you to defend yourself inside her story. So I set conversational boundaries that would sound abrupt if you do not understand self-respect, and I smiled just enough to keep the peace while choosing not to purchase it, which is a different habit than the one I had learned as a younger woman who used to patch holes with phone calls and favors and baked goods. When the cake rolled out and the room launched into the song, Linda performed her favorite bit, the throwaway line about my birthday being last week or next week, who can keep track, followed by the little air kiss that suggests affection without cost. And the crowd laughed the way crowds laugh when the host writes the rules, and I did something that used to feel impossible but now felt like maintenance. I did not react. I did not correct the date. I did not make a joke to prove I was not hurt. I simply let the moment pass because my phone in my bag had what I actually needed: a message from Maya about a counter we had expected and a seller who wanted a slightly tighter timeline, which meant I had a small window to decide whether to push or to accept, and I chose to excuse myself, walk to the hallway outside the ballroom, and call the only person who had earned access to the numbers, who walked me through the clause we had flagged earlier and reminded me that leverage is not volume. It is timing. Dana found me on my way back to the table and, with that blend of warmth and optics she has perfected, floated the idea of a joint family trip to the coast because Ryan loves the ocean energy. A phrase that told me she was rehearsing a caption while testing whether I would take the bait, and I gave her the safest answer in the world, which is yes in theory and no in calendar. A sentence that tells the truth without giving away the part of the truth that belongs to me, because in less than a week I planned to be down there for the inspection, not for a performance, and I did not intend to have a conversation about it in a hallway lined with party favors. Back inside, I kept the temperature low, hugged the cousins who only texted holidays, and watched how people orbit power without knowing they are doing it. Because there is always a crowd within the crowd where decisions get made about seating charts and who is family and who is satellite, and this time I was not applying for entry. I was gathering data, which sounds colder than it felt. Because here is the strange gift of living through enough cycles of the same scene. Eventually you stop wanting to fix the scene and you start writing a new one with your feet, which is exactly what I did when the dance floor got busy and the photographer's light began to search for Ryan's good side, because I slipped out the side door, sat in my car where the only light was the screen I owned, and I opened the offer, reread the terms, and signed with hands that were steady, not because I am fearless, but because I had practiced moving forward without everyone's permission. I called Maya from the car and we set the next steps like people who manage projects for a living, not fairy tales but lists, and when I drove home I did not check the group chat even once because I already knew what it would say: photos of Ryan, Linda's captions about tradition, Mark's quiet approvals, and since none of that would repair the part of me that went thirsty for so long, I chose water from a different source, sleep and spreadsheets, and the resolve to keep my mouth shut around the people who treat my openness like a buffet. The morning after, Linda sent a family text with a collage of Ryan blowing out candles and wrote that family is everything, which used to send me into an argument with myself about what that sentence costs the quiet one, but instead I left the message unread. Opened the lender portal, uploaded the last document they needed, and sent 3 emails to insurance agents about wind and hail policies, because adulthood is not the glamorous part of the post, it is the boring backbone that makes the post possible, and the more I did these simple, unfancy tasks, the more the desperation drained out of me, replaced by a kind of grounded forward motion that did not require anyone's applause to keep going. And then the flip I did not script arrived like a notification I did not know to expect, because in the same hour the seller accepted my offer with the timeline we wanted, Linda jumped into the family group chat to announce an all-family beach trip for late summer. Tagged me to say I should plan it because Ava is so organized, and crowned me the logistics lead for a vacation to the very place I was secretly buying, which meant the person who never gets a microphone just got handed the stage, while holding the deed in her back pocket, and I had to decide whether to laugh, to panic, or to play it better than I have ever played anything in my life. This changes the rules forever. When you choose silence, people show you their playbook, and I did not really believe that line until the week everything came due at once. The inspection with its boring but necessary list, the underwriter's ping for a stray transfer explanation, an HOA notice that could have stalled the close if handled sloppily, and Dana's suddenly frequent check-ins that pretended to be about recipes and turned, with the smoothness of someone who understands optics, into questions about whether I had any big plans that might affect the family trip Linda had announced without asking me, which meant my margin for error was shrinking even as my leverage grew. And the only way to keep both intact was to treat every step like the work I do best, steady, documented, and immune to theatrics that do nothing but waste oxygen I need for signatures and wiring instructions. The inspector walked through the place with the kind of methodical patience that makes other people yawn and makes me feel safe, and while most of the items were small enough to solve with a Saturday and a competent handyman, one problem actually mattered. A railing that would not pass code without reinforcement, which sounds like a headache until you remember this is exactly why inspections exist, so we wrote it into the addendum. The seller agreed to fix it prior to closing with photos for proof, and I put a note in my phone to verify the work with my own eyes, because the version of me who used to outsource judgment to louder voices does not live here anymore, and, honestly, that felt like a bigger renovation than anything the house needed. Underwriting popped up next with a request for a letter of explanation about a small transfer I had made between accounts, the kind of thing you forget immediately after you do it, yet the kind of thing a lender wants footnotes for. So I wrote a clear paragraph, attached the statements, and uploaded them to the portal without asking anyone for advice, which kept me from the familiar spiral where Linda would call the transfer suspicious. Mark would say, "Timing is everything," like that answers the question, and Ryan would text a meme that makes everyone laugh while my stomach clenches, and I am not living there anymore either. Then the HOA email landed with a cheery subject line that means trouble hiding under courtesy, an unresolved trash bin violation from the prior owner that had to be cleared on the record before the association would sign off on status for closing. And while past me might have groaned and forwarded it to someone to fix for me, current me took a breath, dialed the contact number, and heard a voice I had not expected since college say hello, because the board member on duty turned out to be Nate, the ex who once knew what my coffee order meant about my mood and who now, apparently, knew exactly how to shepherd a simple problem through a system that scares people who think rules are a wall instead of a door with a latch. And before I could brace for awkwardness, he cut it off by congratulating me, telling me which photos the HOA needed to clear the violation, and offering the name of a reliable handyman in case the railing fix looked sketchy, which was help I did not ask for but did. Except because being an adult also means taking the clean assist without creating a new debt. Dana FaceTimed me that afternoon with a question about the sauce I made for Christmas 2 years ago, and 30 seconds in she pivoted with the same tone influencers use when they want a headline. Did I have anything exciting coming up that might affect scheduling? And I kept my answers lined up like steady beads. Yes to a heavy work sprint, no to public plans, maybe to the trip if dates did not collide, because silence is not lying when the truth belongs to you until the deed records. And while we chatted, I watched her eyes do that microscan that means someone is collecting incidental details, and I felt, not threatened, but oddly calm, the way you do when you finally recognize a pattern you used to pretend was random. Nate texted that night to confirm the HOA cleared the bin issue, and I thanked him with the brevity that says we are adults, not a subplot, and then I took out my tiny list for closing day. Which amused me because here comes the line that will make comment sections twitch. I have never owned a car. I am one of those city people who never needed to. And the next morning I drove my old Civic to the attorney's office with a folder of documents and 2 pens, because if you know, you know, the closing stack is real and nobody wants to pause to hunt for ink when the wire confirmation has cleared and the attorney is ready to move. And I signed until my hand ached in that satisfying way that says your choices are now printed in black and white and do not require a family meeting to exist. The attorney was kind and efficient, explained what mattered and skimmed what did not, slid the keys across the table with a professional smile, and wished me luck. And I walked into an empty house that was not a metaphor and not a mood board, but a place with a utility panel and a water shutoff and a bill with my name on it, and I stood in the quiet long enough to inventory what actually needed doing next. Insurance confirmations, electric account setup, internet installation, a small list for a handyman who could be trusted to reinforce a railing without inventing a dozen surprises, and then my phone lit up with the kind of digital ambient noise that makes people think urgency equals importance. The family group chat exploding with photos from a beach that was not my town where Ryan and Dana had spent the afternoon manifesting the summer trip. Linda playing cruise director from her couch and asking me to pull together a spreadsheet of options because Ava is so organized, and Mark asking if I could remind everyone to send deposits on time, and I did what you do when you know the real answer cannot be said yet. I let the thread scroll without me, and I opened my email. There was one voicemail I had not pressed yet, from Aunt Carol, the relative who never plays central casting, but always knows where the receipts lie, and when I listened, her voice carried that mix of apology and resolve that usually precedes something you cannot unhear, because she said she had kept quiet for too long about a transfer my parents made years back when Ryan was underwater. That the money labeled for my future had been used to bail him out with the intention of paying it back later, and that later never arrived, and before I posted anything that would pour gasoline on a story Linda was already trying to shape, I needed to know what I was owed, not in affection or Instagram, but in simple arithmetic, which landed in my chest like a key clicking in a lock I had not even known was there. Do you know why the rich keep getting richer? Control of the story, which sounds like something you hear in a seminar with too much air conditioning until you are sitting on a floor that you paid for with your own signature, holding Aunt Carol's voicemail in one hand and your phone camera in the other, and realizing that if you do not set the frame right now, then Linda will draft a family statement that turns your life into a subplot about gratitude, and Ryan will toss in a winking comment that converts years of unequal treatment into a cute anecdote about how families help each other. So I did the only thing that made sense. I picked one angle that showed the fact of a new beginning without inviting a fight about taste. I wrote a plain sentence about new keys and the friends who helped me get here. I tagged no one and hashtagged nothing, and I pressed post with the same steady breath I used when I signed at closing, because this time the action was the message, and there was nothing to sell. The first 20 minutes moved the way these things always move when you have normal friends and extended relatives with fast thumbs. A wave of congratulations from people who have known me since high school and coworkers who watch me keep trains running without asking for credit, and then, because the internet is a magnet for whatever unresolved truth is in the room, the thread tilted. Not with open hostility at the start, but with loaded questions phrased as curiosity. Someone from our town asked whether this was the fund Grandma started. A cousin wrote family comes through, with a smile that stung because Aunt Carol's voicemail was still ringing in my head, and Ryan dropped the line that made everything worse, a breezy, proud of you, sis, family support is real. Which was either careless or strategic, and in this family there is usually no difference. So within an hour the comments were a mess, and a local Facebook group where I did not even have an account had screen capped my post with a caption about Nepo Beach House, and people were tagging Linda to demand a statement like we were a brand. I felt the familiar heat rush up my neck, and then my work phone buzzed with Evelyn's name, and I answered, because if there is one voice that reduces noise to the next step it is hers, and she said two things in that even tone that cuts through panic without erasing it. 1. Congratulations. You do not need to justify the timing or the purchase to anyone at work, and 2. Do not engage on company channels. Remember the NDA attached to the bonus and route any pressure to me, because you earned that check for operational continuity, and the company is not going to be drawn into a family drama on Slack by someone who spent lunchtime reading a neighborhood gossip page, and that was enough to put structure back around my day. Because once the job piece was contained, I could think about the family piece without losing the floor under my feet. I called Aunt Carol back, and she picked up like she had been waiting in a hallway with a folder, which, knowing her, is exactly what she had been doing internally for years, and she told me what I already suspected but had never been able to prove. That when Ryan's job fell apart and his lease card disappeared and the insurance penalties stacked up, Mark used cash from an account that had been labeled for me when Grandma passed, that the story at the time was it would be a short-term bridge that Ryan would pay back, that Linda pushed for speed and image management because a repossession would humiliate the family, and that nothing was ever returned to my side even after the crisis ended. All of which would have been a fight about memory if she had not kept a photocopy of a ledger entry with my name on the originating account and Ryan's checking account as the destination. Which meant I had simple math and not a story to carry into whatever conversation was about to happen next. The DM shifted from thinly veiled judgment to performance coaching, Dana suggesting that transparency would defuse the speculation and that maybe a caption about family working together would calm people down, which translated to me providing a cover narrative that kept Linda's public image intact, and I could feel my hands shake with the old habit of rushing to soothe. But then my phone buzzed with a text from Nate, short and practical, letting me know the HOA page had lit up with neighbors curious about short-term rentals, that he had reminded the board to keep comments within bylaws and to avoid personal speculation, and that, if I wanted, I could skip the next meeting because a cap discussion was on the agenda and it would be loud. And that tiny slice of adult competent support, no drama, no angle, just a heads up, steadied me in a way 100 likes never could. I sat on the floor and wrote the message I would send exactly once and only to the people who needed to see it, a short note to Linda and Mark that said I had purchased the house with my income and savings, that I had received a confidential performance bonus governed by an NDA, which meant I would not discuss the details publicly, and that I now knew, thanks to Aunt Carol, that money earmarked for me had been diverted to Ryan years ago during his crisis, that I was not asking for a reimbursement plan or a public confession, but that I would not perform a gratitude narrative that erased the cost I paid in silence, while everyone applauded him, and that I expected going forward to make choices about attendance and contribution without guilt or commentary, which is a long way of saying I was done giving consent to my own erasure. Linda called within minutes, crying in that way that sits halfway between remorse and PR, saying she wished I had told the family first, asking what people would think if I did not correct the post to acknowledge the family effort. And I said gently and directly that I would not write a line that made a lie true, that the truth was I paid, the company paid me for my work, and a separate truth was that a fund with my name on it had been used for Ryan without return, and that if she needed to save face, she could tell people I preferred privacy, because I was willing to carry my outcome, but not her narrative, and we sat in a silence that felt like the first honest thing in years. Work tried to drift in via a Slack ping from a colleague who had seen the local group post, and I redirected it to Evelyn exactly as instructed. Then I turned the phone face down because the steady storm of "explain yourself" is a machine that never runs out of fuel if you keep feeding it, and instead I opened my email and sent utilities the start dates, scheduled internet, and replied to the insurance agent with the wind and hail riders we had discussed. Because if there is one lesson I wish somebody taught younger daughters early, it is that the most radical act is not the Instagram caption, it is the bill paid on time with your own money. By evening, the public thread had gone feral, strangers pontificating about fairness, an old classmate asking if I had any advice for leveraging family support, a neighbor from my parents' town dropping a snide line about how some people are born lucky, and I felt the temptation to draft a manifesto, to drop the ledger image and scorch the earth, but I remembered the only rule that has worked for me this year, that silence is not surrender when it is chosen, it is strategy. So I texted Linda and Mark the 3-sentence truth and told them I was willing to talk face to face, not to settle the internet, but to settle us. And I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and listened to the house breathe in a way that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the absence of performance. And when Linda called again the next morning and asked in that careful, measured voice if we could sort this out face to face before it gets worse, did she mean a conversation where we finally lay down the receipts and change the rules? Or a meeting where I get pulled back into the old script and told to apologize for making a private decision without the family's permission? One rule that replaces 100 tips. You teach people how to treat you by what you reward, and it felt almost absurd that it took me nearly 4 decades to absorb something so simple. Yet as I drove to my parents' house on that Sunday morning with Aunt Carol's photocopied ledger in my bag and my closing disclosure folded neatly into an envelope, I understood that this meeting was not just about explaining a house purchase or defending a post on the internet. It was about deciding whether I would continue to live as the quiet background character in someone else's story or finally define the terms of my own, knowing full well that Linda would want the conversation to circle back to public perception. Mark would want to minimize damage with as few words as possible, and Ryan, though not present physically, would hover like a ghost because every decision they made always bent in his direction even when it meant breaking me in half. The living room looked exactly the same as it always had, the same overstuffed chairs, and a coffee table stacked with magazines that no one ever actually reads. Yet the air was different because Linda had laid out photo albums as if nostalgia could soften math. And she opened with her polished anecdote about how birthdays were always productions because Ryan had been shy and needed encouragement, which she delivered like an explanation for decades of imbalance rather than what it was. A justification rehearsed so often that she probably believed it, and I let her finish without interruption because one of the hardest lessons I have learned is that you do not have to wrestle someone's version of the past when you have present tense receipts. So instead of arguing history, I slid 3 sheets of paper onto the table: my pre-approval letter dated before Ryan's gala, my closing disclosure showing the exact funds I had provided, and Aunt Carol's photocopy of the transfer that moved money labeled for me into Ryan's account when his life collapsed. Mark leaned back with that weary gesture men use when they want to signal that the weight of the world rests on their shoulders, then muttered the line I had predicted word for word, that he had meant to fix it later, when things stabilized, only later never came. And Linda rushed in with the vague defense that it was complicated, that family decisions are never linear, that the important thing is everyone survived the crisis. But I cut through with a clarity that surprised even me, saying it was not complicated at all, that money designated for me was used for Ryan, that it was not returned, and that therefore the narrative that my new house was somehow funded by a family pot was not only misleading but insulting. And the silence that followed landed heavier than any shouted argument, because for once no one could twist the words into ambiguity. I told them I was not there to demand repayment or to stage a public humiliation, that what I wanted was twofold: a short acknowledgement in writing that the transfer had happened and had never been reversed, and a commitment that going forward I would choose which family events I attended and contributed to without enduring guilt trips, sarcastic asides, or public jokes at my expense. Because the price of staying in the role they had carved out for me was far higher than the benefit, and I was no longer willing to pay it. Linda looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and fear, asking what people would think if I skipped Thanksgiving, and I answered as calmly as I could that people would think whatever she told them, because her need to control perception was not my responsibility anymore, and that if she wanted to preserve an image she could do so without using me as the uncredited stagehand. Mark apologized in his quiet way, not dramatic, not detailed, just a simple admission that he had failed to make it right, and that was the closest thing to honesty I had ever heard from him. While Linda's face tightened and then softened again as she asked whether I would still let her visit the beach house if she promised to come as a guest, not as the director of the show, and I surprised myself by saying yes, because my goal was never punishment but freedom, and granting access on my terms was the clearest proof that I was finally steering my own life rather than reacting to theirs. The conversation ended not with hugs or tears, but with a new contract, unspoken yet real, that they would sign the short acknowledgement, that I would not be dragged into repairing the comment section of my own post, and that I would not be expected to play the role of reliable background support in Ryan's endless highlight reel. And as I drove home, I felt a strange mixture of grief and triumph. Grief for the years I had spent training myself to accept crumbs, and triumph for the fact that I had chosen silence as a tool rather than a cage. By the time I pulled into the driveway of the beach house, my phone buzzed with a message request from someone I did not know but whose last name matched my grandmother's maiden name, and the note was short and unsettling, that there was more to the story of the fund, that a version of my grandmother's will had never been filed correctly, and that if I was ready they could show me a page that might change how I understood everything, and I stood there with the key in my hand, staring at the ocean I had not yet decided whether to share, wondering if I had finally won the only battle that mattered or if, just maybe, the real game had only begun.